My name is Kobus van der Wath, and I'm a South African based in Beijing. 15 years ago, I founded the Beijing Axis here in Beijing in Tiananmen Square, of all places. So we're very involved in China's integration with the world, politically, economically, and business-wise, with many clients in China that we help abroad and international businesses that we've supported here in China. That means that Belt and Road Initiative is really important for us, and I'm very excited about that, and we are as a business. Please join us for a discussion on The Point with Liu Xin.
Kobus, thank you very much for joining us today. First of all, tell us a little bit about your experience here in China.
So I've been in China a long time. It's 15 years now, and I'm the founder of the Beijing Axis. And in 2002, moved to China, sat in Tiananmen Square, first on the steps of the Great Hall of the People, until the guards ushered me away and I walked across to the museum, and worked on the business plan for what is today the Beijing Axis. The last 15 years has been absolutely phenomenal. I still feel as if I'm a student of China in every sense of the word. It is so rich. It is so profound to see this transition and this transformation, and I feel really honored to have been part of it. It's really the wink of an eye. 15 years has never gone so quickly. Sure. But traveling in different regions, I think I've been to every province in China except one, and I hope to fill that in, and having a very good time.
And the latest cause is, of course, the Belt and Road Initiative. Everybody is talking about that since the past 3 years or so. What do you find interesting about this initiative, and what do you find challenging or slightly confusing, maybe?
Well, I think it's still early days, even though it's been 3-4 years. But I must say, over the last 1 year, I started to take note of Belt and Road.
Why only since last year?
Initially, having now been in China for a while, I've seen things like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. I've seen the New Development Bank, or BRICS Bank. I've seen FOCAC. I've seen SEO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and so on and so forth. And I know they always develop over time. Initially, it was not clear to me personally how this would develop and where it would go. But
what changed?
I think just the inclusiveness of it. The energy, the thinking behind it, the thrust, from the highest levels of government in China firstly, but the buy-in from around the world. And, I see it as very geographic. It has this overland economic belt, and it has the maritime sea route aspect to it. But it's gone far beyond that. If you go back and you look at history, it's kind of defined what was included in ancient times in this. But now, we're seeing vast parts of East Africa pulled in, the further south areas of Southeast Asia, far west of Europe. And even I saw a headline recently, with engagement in the Americas. So I think it is becoming a very important framework for development and for many initiatives. And I think therefore I had to take note and ask myself, and we ask ourselves, what does it mean for us?
As an entrepreneur, how have you come to the Belt and Road Initiative?
Yes, well, firstly, we have our existing strategy, that we update on a regular basis. And we've been expanding into India, we've been expanding into Southeast Asia. China, in a way, at the core of the strategy. We're also, of course, in Africa. But what we've seen now is that there are some specific developments around synchronizing policy, infrastructure and capacity and connectivity, trade, investment, people-to-people exchanges at the heart of Belt and Road Initiative that come into these regions that I've mentioned. And we need to take cognizance of that and say, how do we look at our global procurement business differently? How do we look at our international sales activation business differently? And then on the advisory side, we do transaction advisory and strategic advisory. How do we look at that differently, given these capital flows, trade flows, people flows, needs for strategic intelligence that will now arise because of Belt and Road? And we've seen a huge overlap. If anything, Belt and Road reinforces our earlier views on what is our value to add in our chosen markets and how do we position. So it really just adds excitement for us. We may have to adjust, open offices more quickly in certain countries or partner differently. And we are very actively looking at all of that. But at this stage, I think it's a big positive for us. We see it as a huge opportunity because so many countries, businesses, pieces of global value chains are coming together, and there are many questions. And we're in that business. We solve business problems in those procurement, sales activation, advisory areas. So it's very exciting.
Over the past 3 years, have you seen the kind of interest by foreign enterprises increasing about the Belt and Road Initiative or about doing business with China or attracting Chinese investment as a result of the Belt and Road Initiative?
Look, I think so, especially more recently. I would, again, as I told you earlier, my interest really started to peak in the last 1 year to 18 months. Earlier than that, I think it was still a tentative interest on my part, and I see that mirrored in how business associates, partners, commentators that we interact with have looked at it. That's all different now. Everyone is taking a step closer. There's the upcoming summit. People are very interested to see how that goes down, and then the specific sub-initiatives that will come out of that, and how that can become practical for them. So definitely, I think the groundswell that I mentioned is clearer, and people are becoming more strategic about that and mobilizing resources. Once that happens, you need to know you're already late if you are not moving, because I think things will accelerate.
Sure.
And then you need to be in place.
Yeah. There are different topics, let's say, of this summit. There are the connectivity, infrastructure, finance, policy connection, and also cultural exchanges, how to connect people. Which one or which ones will you be paying most attention to?
Perhaps at the core for me would be to talk about financing. That is often a bottleneck, and linking that to actionable projects. When you talk to financiers, they always talk about the limited projects available to invest in, as if that's really the headache. And if you talk to people with projects, they talk about how do I access capital? And I think this is where you need to bring those people with the right thinking, ability to implement, together with sources of capital and good projects. What is a good project? How to prioritize if you have more than one in a region, which region to put before the other. All of this needs to be done in a very practical way that is planned, where you have metrics that are defensible. You'll have disagreements. You need to then bring that together, and all of this needs to move in a somewhat concerted manner. And we're in such an early stage here that a lot of that still clearly needs to be worked out. So I look more for that from this period in time and this summit, rather than achieving everything. I mean, I think it's probably in 5 and 10 years that we will really appreciate it, and even well beyond that. Because in China, long-term always means something very different, right? It can mean really long-term.
Well, China has had a very intense cooperation with African countries much longer than the Belt and Road Initiative. And even then, since then, there has been all kinds of criticism of China's role or China's real intention from its African partners. And now this Belt and Road Initiative, how do you look at the kind of suspicion or accusation of China being another, how shall I say, trying to build a network like the imperialist countries in the past, trying to extract more natural resources and exchange and making use of the cheap labor for its own benefit, kind of a one-way process?
Yeah, look, I've heard a lot of this talk for many, many years, and I always get asked, is China a partner or a predator in Africa? And then I have to give them the view. Africa has benefited greatly from China's growth and from China's investment, lending in Africa, from its buying of raw materials and other products in Africa. So I think that's undisputed. But could Africa have benefited more? Yes, I can see different scenarios. So then you start to debate this and people say it's one or the other. I think globalization is inevitable. I think, you know, all these pundits and proponents of the end of globalization, I don't believe that. I think globalization will continue. I think, in fact, China is playing a key role in underscoring and underpinning that. But China's engagement globally is new. You know, of course, there's the ancient times, but if you really think of it, from 2002, when we started as a business until now, we've seen overseas foreign direct investment go from less than $1 billion a year to more than $200 billion last year. So some lessons have been learned, some things have been done for the first time. So that for me is the departure point. Meanwhile, I think all countries, China, the United States, countries in Europe, they act with self-interest. That's natural, that's normal, that should be understood and expected. The question is, can that be achieved, acting with self-interest while you're also doing something where the rest of the international community or a region benefit? And I see no real conflict at this point with Belt and Road Initiative or FOCAC and, you know, China's engagement in Africa as it not having benefit for, you know, these different regions. Of course, you know, we live in a world with suspicion and fear, and we've seen world wars and we've seen conflicts. So I think that's also natural. Although it's 30, 40 years now that China has shifted so much, it's still only a very short space of time. If we think back 20 years of G7, the US, Russia, the Cold War, and G7 concepts like that, now China is there. It's a very different world, and for analysts, commentators, politicians, leaders, it's a shock to the system. I think we will get used to this. Again, you know, sometimes there will be some mistakes made, and then it's a question of how do you correct, self-correct, and sometimes you need to be nudged to see a different perspective. So I'm comfortable with the fact that the engagement in Africa is adding a huge amount of value to the continent. Africa must also make sure that it defines how it wants to engage with the world, and in this case, China, and similarly for Belt and Road. If these countries can organize as countries and as regions, they stand to benefit hugely. Will China benefit along the way? Of course, for sure. Yeah. And its people will, its companies will, but perhaps its strategic, geostrategic objectives will too. And I don't think that there's any issue with that.
Finally, a story to wrap up. Any interesting story you could share with us?
Yeah, we bring hundreds of delegations from the world into China to do business, you know, every year, and we help Chinese with delegations traveling globally in this, you know, space that we're in. So there are many, many stories, but I can really only say that having seen this piece of history has been completely, you know, transformative for me as a person, and I can't wait to see what lies ahead. I can tell you this: I came to China on my own, and now I have a family. I have a Chinese wife. Okay. I have Chinese parents. My mother and father-in-law are Chinese, and so I can tell you, in terms of life stories, sitting around the dinner table, traveling around the country, seeing this story unfold. Is really a privilege and great fun.
And it looks like you will continue this in the future. This
is only the beginning.
This is only the beginning. Thank you very much, Kobus, for accepting our interview today.
Thank you for having me.